We cannot understand Spanish Golden Age theater without recognizing the importance of women who wrote in that era and the weight that women and womanhood had in the works, in the best works of that period as well. That is why we at the Instituto Cervantes London have partnered with our friends from the Institute for Modern Languages Research to launch this small conference on woman and womanhood in the Spanish Golden Age. Thank you very much to the IMLR and most especially to Kathy Collins and Catherine Davis. Today we have gathered three experts, namely Ana Rodriguez, Kathy Mcguire, and also Elena Carreras, to talk to us about different sides of the role of women in the Spanish Golden Age, in the Siglo de Oro. For us at Instituto Cervantes, it is a very important event. We're going to do it in March in Senate House, but we have switched to online mode due to the COVID-19. But we're very proud that we have managed to set it up through the internet. And for us, it is a long-standing commitment to feminine writing. We have had book launches of Ana Caro de Mayen, a very well-known Spanish writer of that epoch. And we have also had live chats with translator Catherine Boyle, for instance, among other activities. I wouldn't like to forget to mention one, which is the translation into English of Wise and Valiant, which is an online exhibit that you can have access to through the internet at cervantes.es. That's all from me. I will let you now enjoy the talks by these three very well-renowned scholars.
I would like to begin by thanking Catherine Davis at the Institute of Modern Languages Research and Ignacio Peiro at the Cervantes Institute in London, and everyone else who's been involved in conceiving this event and making it happen. In the next 20 minutes or so, I plan to discuss a constellation of emotions, attitudes, and claims related to vergüenza, shame, in connection with women and womanhood in early modern Spain and Spanish America. In taking this broad approach, I have a number of aims. To demonstrate the value of narratives as the most widely used forms of organizing human experience, to show how shame can be learned through language and in relation to cultural models, to discuss how shame might be felt or faked by women in particular social situations, to illustrate the function of the two types of shame denoted by the Spanish term vergüenza, and this can be anticipatory shame of the kind you have in the phrase, have you no shame, which makes people restrain from behaviors that might be criticized or might have negative social consequences. And there's also the retrospective shame felt usually after the event. And I will briefly distinguish shaming from shame. And as I go along, I will also note gender differences in the emotional repertoires that accompanied retrospective shame in the pre-modern period. So I'll focus on storytelling, different types of storytelling, thereby offering you an overview of the kinds of sources we have available as researchers. In the first part of the talk, I will look at the kinds of stories which the women of the upper and middling classes were told, and I will discuss their intended educational moral value. My main example will be the biblical story of the rape of Dinah. In the second part, I will look at the stories which women told others about themselves. And as researchers, we have two types of sources for this: autobiographies and inquisitorial trial records in which women were given a voice. I will examine an example of the latter. The third and final part of my talk focuses on early modern women whose stories were told by other people. And this is where we have the widest range of sources, as you can see on the screen. I've chosen to focus on one painting from the mid-17th century and one secular court trial that took place in Santiago de Chile in the early 18th century. Let's begin with the Bible. In the Biblia de Arragel, a Spanish translation produced in the 15th century, we find a depiction of a woman with disheveled hair. And it's a visual representation of the ritual called sota, which was described in the book of Numbers, intended for women whose husbands suspected them of adultery. This public humiliation might have served to reassure husbands and to prevent shame from destroying the woman's life. This ritual solution appears to be a more civilized option than the savage actions which, according to Genesis 34, were taken by two of Jacob's sons to avenge the rape of the sister Dinah. Like Dinah, they were the children of Jacob's unloved wife Leah. And on the screen, I show you the beginning of the story in three different Spanish translations: a medieval Bible, the mid-16th century Jewish Biblia de Ferrara, and the version produced by the Spanish Protestant Casiodoro de la Reina in 1559, which was published in Basel some 40 years later. I'm showing you these three versions to give you a sense of the breadth and diversity of early modern Spanish culture, and to give you an indication of the variety of terms used to tell one event. Dina was raped, forzada, defiled, amancillada, and dishonored, deshonrada, in one act. The passages on the screen also show the causal sequence of events. If Dina had not gone out, if she had stayed at home, she would not have been seen by Shechem, the eldest son of the ruler of a people who were not circumcised. The succinct biblical version tells us that the rape was a consequence of Shechem seeing her. And even if he subsequently falls in love with Dinah and wants to marry her, her brothers believe that he has treated her like a harlot. What he's done is an insult to her whole family and brings them all dishonor. As you can see from the text on the screen, the brothers' shame manifests as distress, se entristecieron, and anger, saña, and wrath, ira. This is pre-modern anger, which Aristotle and Aristotelians well into the 17th century understood as their desire for revenge. We begin to see differences in the emotional repertoire, the repertoires available for women and for men in response to shame. And in my wider research project on shame, I interpret Calderon's Médico de su Honra, among other cultural products from this period, in this slide. Back to Dina. You can see from the image on the screen, which is from Book of Genesis found in the British Library, that Dina's story forms part of pre-modern European culture. And in Spain, there were many recreations of the story of Dina, and this included a ballad, a play, a written poem, and discussions in moral and political treatises like the one on your screen by Juan Vela. I will focus on the play and the poem. The play, El Robo de Dina, written around 1615 or maybe before 1622, has been attributed to Lope de Vega. In the first act, Lope stresses Dina's beauty and the effect it had on Shechem. When he sees her, he succumbs to her beauty, as you can see on the screen. And I have a question for you. Is Lope eliciting or seeking to elicit his audience's sympathy for this man who, after seeing Dina's beauty, believed that he was unable to control himself? Blaming the woman's beauty was one of the commonplaces of the courtly love tradition. It was also a well-known strategy in early modern Spanish culture. Think, for instance, of Grisóstomo in Don Quixote, who blames Marcela before committing suicide. The onus was placed on women. Well-to-do women from respectable families were expected to stay at home and or avoid being seen. Lope's elaboration of Dina in this play emphasizes the idea still prevailing in early modern Europe that rape was a crime against the whole of a woman's family, against the social order. Rape was seen as a theft and as a stain, mancilla. The shame in such cases was retrospective and it was shared. This idea is captured by the words which Lope puts in Dina's mouth. Has infamado mi casa. You've brought shame on my family. And as you can see in Act 3, Lope, like the church fathers who had discussed the story of Dina previously, puts the blame on her because she chose to leave her home out of curiosity to see if the women of Shechem were as beautiful as they were said to be. But Lope's theatrical version departs from the earlier patristic approaches in that it gives her a voice, it gives her point of view. She accepts her guilt, yes, but only partly, because as she claims, she took care to protect her chastity and she wore a veil and behaved with modesty, honestamente. 4 decades later, the Aragonese poet Juan de Moncayo y Gurrea rewrote Dina's story in one of his rimas. Using the third person, he emphasized Dina's guilt more than Lope had done. The lesson to learn from Moncayo's version is that women should exercise restraint. The verses on the screen suggest that women should cultivate shame, anticipatory shame, as a way of overcoming their vanity. My argument is that this anticipatory form of shame, which should help women restrain their passions, could be learned and cultivated. Books intended for the education of women, like the bestseller written by Juan Luis Vives in the 1520s, taught women to feel this form of shame by getting them to imagine the disastrous consequences of women's lack of sexual restraint. I quote Fantasi's translation and adaptation from it. A girl who has lost her chastity will find, through her fault, everything sad, unhappy, mournful, hateful, and hostile to her. What will be the sorrow of her relatives when they sense that they are all dishonored because of the base conduct of one girl? What will be their grief? What tears will be shed by parents and those who nurtured her? What hatred will this arouse in the members of your household? What will be the talk of neighbors, friends, and acquaintances in denouncing this wicked girl? What derision, what gossip there will be among girls of her age, what loathing her girl friends will have for her, how she will be avoided wherever she goes. This shows that the shame that can be expected as a consequence of one's action can be felt just by imagining it or anticipating it. And the fear of gossip, of what people might say, was and is one of the main components of shame. The message that death was preferable to shame had been promoted since antiquity through other stories, which, like the Bible, were presented as models. Think of legendary stories like that of Lucretia, Roman noblewoman who killed herself out of shame to restore her family's reputation after being raped by Tarquin. Lucretia's story was told time and again in poems, plays, and paintings in the pre-modern period, and most of the discussions of Lucretia, except for Augustine's, presented her as a hero. To the second part of the talk, the stories the women told others about themselves. Of all the inquisitorial trials I have come across, the one which offers evidence of the widest range of concepts and experiences of shame is that of the 42-year-old mulata Heleno de Céspedes. She appeared in an auto de fe in the main square of Toledo on the 18th of December 1588. She was dressed as a penitent wearing a coroza and insignias. She was convicted under charges of sorcery and disrespect for the marriage sacrament. She had married a woman at the age of 40, when still married to the man who had abandoned her some 24 years earlier after the birth of their child. Since she had no facial hair, Elena had been examined by various surgeons and physicians who had certified that she was a man, that she was endowed with male sexual organs. But during the inquisitorial trials, Elena had new physical examinations and no evidence was found of any male genitalia. Elena's defense strategies do not only show great agency, but also challenge their long-standing assumption that women have a sense of modesty, pudor, that is a natural attribute in them. Elena does not seem to have been embarrassed at all when discussing the changing shape of her genitals during the inquisitorial interrogations, or when replying to their questions about whether she had had pollutions like a man. Did Elena feel shame? She claims she did, and this seems to have been the most effective part of her self-defense strategy. Having given inquisitors different versions of her story, Elena was asked if the confessions she made to them were similar to the declarations she had made previously. Her answer was that in Ocaña, where she had been arrested by the secular authorities, 2 confessions had been extracted from her, but she had not told the truth because she feared that they would not treat her justly, and she was hoping that the inquisitors would. And because she was ashamed. In fact, having her case transferred to the inquisitorial tribunal worked to Elena's advantage because the secular court would have sentenced her to death for sodomy. One of the historians who have studied this case has suggested that part of Elena's punishment was to endure the shame of hearing her sentence in a public auto de fe. And the punishment received by Elena included a public shaming consisting of 200 lashes. Half of them were given to her while she was paraded through the streets of Toledo, stripped to her waist. The remaining 100 lashes were given to her 11 days later in Cienpozuelos after her sentence was read out in the local parish church. I would like to note here that we should not confuse shaming, the punishment, with shame, the feeling, even if both concepts are denoted by the Spanish term vergüenza. The problem is that we have no way of knowing whether the shaming actually made Elena feel any shame. It could equally be suggested that she or he might have felt humiliated having to wear a skirt during the 10-year confinement that was inflicted on her as part of her sentence. I would also like to draw attention to a related aspect that no scholar who has worked on this case has stopped to think about: the shame that might have been felt by Elena's wife, Maria del Caño, and by Maria's father. They were the reason why part of the flogging was done in Cienpozuelos, the town where Maria had grown up and where her father still lived. Can we not imagine the reactions of the people of Cienpozuelos when they saw Maria's husband paraded through the town, exposed as a woman and as a sorcerer? Did they believe that Maria and her father had been deceived? Did they laugh at them, or did they scorn them? Let's bear in mind that the shaming inflicted by neighbors was often more powerful and was more felt than public acts of shaming, such as lashes and autos de fe. Now, the third part of my presentation starts with the image that was used in the publicity for this event. In Murillo's Two Women at the window, painted around 1655, there is no clear evidence that the young woman feels any shame, and she doesn't seem to be at all concerned with the recommendations of moralists that women should not be seen. If the older woman is a chaperone, as has been suggested, they might be looking out of the window to combat the boredom or tediousness of having to spend all day at home. But what if the young woman is a maid who is taking a break from house chores and is trying to find some entertainment and possibly a man to flirt with by looking out of the window? What if she's a prostitute or a girl who needs financial support and the old woman is an alcahueta, a go-between or procuress, rather than a chaperone? The main questions which scholars have asked about this painting are whether the young woman's smile is enticing or innocent, and whether the older woman's use of her shawl is a flirtatious or a polite gesture. And no one has a definite answer. As I said, it is context that gives meaning to their gestures, and we don't have the context. If we saw this as a brother's window, then the girl's smile would seem more enticing than innocent. Then we may notice that the older woman is also smiling, judging from her eye gestures. Is it possible that the older woman keeps her mouth covered to hide her bad teeth and thus become more attractive? This interpretation would suggest that her gestures are acts of false modesty or false recato of the kind that might help her business. But there is at least one other interpretation. If you've read Cervantes' novela El celoso extremeño, published in Spanish in 1613 and in English in 1640 as The Jealous Husband, you will remember that the male protagonist, who's almost 80, marries a girl who's 15 because he has seen her at her window and she is so beautiful that he cannot help himself. Her parents do not have money for a dowry to be able to marry her off well, but by allowing her to be at the window, perhaps accompanied by her mother, they are able to uh, make the most of her beauty. And the moment she marries, she is forced to live in a house without windows. And this suggests that in early 17th century Spain, women could not be expected to be as able to restrain themselves as moralists would have expected, and that anticipatory shame was not as effective as they would have wanted it to be. I'll end with a court case from colonial Chile in which one woman, a widow named Doña Petronila Zúñiga Figueroa, did everything she could to change the story of another woman, her 15-year-old daughter, Antonia Valenzuela. On the 12th of September 1720, the widow who owned and stayed in Chimbarongo in Colchagua filed charges in Santiago against a 33-year-old married man, a mestizo, named Julian Santos, for ravishing and kidnapping Antonia. The charges were estupro, rapto, extracción. Doña Petronila had 7 daughters, and apparently, at least according to a witness testimony, Antonia was the only one who led a bad life. Ha vivido siempre mal. Antonia had left home and fled to the Quillota Valley with Julian and 2 Spanish men, and when they were found, Julian was arrested and put in jail, and Antonia was placed in a convent. By pressing charges against him, Doña Petronila was seeking to restore her daughter's reputation, if not her virginity, so she could go ahead with her plan to marry her off to a respectable Spanish man. One of the witnesses provided by the widow asserted that the girl was a virgin, doncella, known for her modesty, recato, and that her mother was at home with her, ensuring that she had a very secluded life, con mucho recogimiento. This image seems completely fictional in the light of Julian's declaration, which suggested that Antonia was often seen around the hacienda on her horse, moving along the cattle, alone or with her sisters, and that she had provoked Julian sexually with her compliments and with her clear demonstrations of her love for him. As he put it, su deshonestidad con la cual al confesante le provocó. In Julian's view, there was no rape, estupro, because he was simply acting out of weakness, como hombre frágil. This seems to be an old story. A year into the trial, Doña Petronila filed new charges against Julian, and this time for calumny. The records of the second trial include a witness testimony supporting Julian's version of the story. Antonia had always been busy with manly tasks. Se ocupaba siempre de ejercicios varoniles, such as lassoing the cattle. She was often seen walking alone in the monte, sometimes riding on horseback like a man. And she was known to have had illicit relationships, amistades ilícitas, with several men before Julian. But it seems as if the widow's litigations helped her to clear the family name, at least formally. And this case shows that young women like Antonia had more agency than we tend to attribute to early modern women. But it also shows that in the end, what prevailed was power and money, and that the wealthier older woman is the one who has the greatest agency. This is simply one example of the use of the judicial system in early modern Spain and the Spanish New World to prevent well-to-do women who had sex outside marriage from bringing dishonor and shame on their families. To conclude, we've seen how anticipatory shame could be taught and learned by eliciting and by cultivating fear. But this form of shame could also be faked. Modesty or recato was not a natural attribute in women as has traditionally been thought. It was often a pose. And as you can see, there is much about the gestures and meanings of emotions from the past that remains untold. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you especially to Ignacio and to Kathy, not only for organising this event, but also for so efficiently and so graciously moving it online at quite late notice. By means of an introduction, my name is Catherine Mcguire. I'm a third year PhD student at Queen Mary here in London. I'm a member of the Living with Feeling project at the Centre for the History of the Emotions, and my doctoral project considers how textual and rhetorical practices in medical and moral literature in early modern Spain could generate emotional order among mothers to ensure the well-being of their children. In other words, I'm interested in how part of becoming and part of being a mother in early modern Spain entailed the regulation of the emotions and the idea of maternal emotions as being active agents in safeguarding the health of children. Today, I would like to focus on shrine literature or miracle literature. That's literature that accompanies a particular shrine or statue or a holy place that's written in order to support its claims to privilege and thereby encouraging the faithful to make pilgrimage there. I'm really focusing on the articulation of hope. Not only as expressed within the miracle narratives, but also how particular textual and rhetorical features of these texts could elicit hope from a maternal audience. This paper this morning is really going to function as a sort of work in progress. I'm going to explain why shrine literature can be a really important source for mining information about motherhood in early modern Spain, what the generic aims of shrine literature are, and how these aims give way to a number of textual and rhetorical features that could inspire hope in an audience. So for the purposes of my thesis and for this presentation today, I'm looking at texts from 6 Marian shrines across Spain, which should be on the screen right now, in Almudena in Madrid, Atocha also in Madrid, Guadalupe in Extremadura, Montserrat outside Barcelona, Peña de Francia in Salamanca, and Valvanera in La Rioja. So even though these texts are produced in different parts of Spain, describing different miracles, different holy places, they do share some important features. They usually describe the foundation of the shrine, its claims to holiness, and most importantly, they're full of these little micro narratives of these miracles, which explain how people were helped by that particular appellation of the Virgin Mary. I would contend that there are 2 functions to these kinds of texts that are really foundational to eliciting hope from an audience. The first is promotional. In order to support the shrine's claim to being a holy place that can legitimately be known as a shrine and benefit from the pilgrimages from the faithful, the shrine books need to not only give the shrine a sort of coherent, sanctioned origin narrative, but they also need to show that miracles are happening. Miracle tales are sort of advertisements for a shrine. The second function of these texts is that they're instructive. They don't just give us a window into practices of popular devotion, as important as that is, but they can also show readers and listeners models of faith and of piety that can elicit an intervention from the divine. I'm saying readers and listeners very deliberately here. Because these shrine books are both promotional and instructive, we can make a reasonable assumption that these miracle collections circulated orally as well as in a written form. Juan Carlos Vizuete Mendoza's study of miracle collections as a distinct literary genre in Spain concludes that these texts could have been read aloud at the shrines themselves, or at least part of these texts. He writes that the instructional and promotional functions of these texts se realiza mediante la lectura pública de algunos de los milagros asentados en los libros. And this notion of oral circulation also appears in the prologue to the 1550 Montserrat edition, which was supposed to be in the PowerPoint, I'm afraid it's not. Conviene que los tales maravillas y milagros saben, no los escondan. Antes los publiquen a gloria de Dios y de los santos y para el bien y provecho de las ánimas de los que los oyeren. So here we encounter 2 things. The first is that these are texts which are supposed to be heard, oyeren, but they are texts that are supposed to edify the listener and their souls in some way. And these were tales which would have formed part of the soundscape of these early modern sites of pilgrimage and devotion. What's more, with the texts connected to the larger shrines, such as Atocha and Montserrat, these miracles are being updated in various editions. These are not stagnant fables from the past, but these are miracle collections that are constantly being renewed and updated. They're contemporary. An early modern pilgrim would have seen evidence of the kind of contemporaneity of shrines, of miracles at the shrines themselves, with examples of ex votos, which are usually little gifts or paintings given in thanks or recognition of a vow that they had made to a saint. This is not a Spanish example or indeed an early modern example, but I think it's an interesting little illustration. So this is from the Church of San Agostino in Rome, and the statue there is the Madonna Del Parto, which is the Madonna of childbirth. And you can see on the right that there's dozens, hundreds of little cards and letters and ribbons with little notes thanking the Virgin Mary for having kept them or a family member safe and for the safe delivery of their child. From a methodological standpoint, I think one question emerges, which is why these texts? What can these texts tell us about motherhood or the emotions? Well, certainly it seems like not very many people have asked that question, because the use of miracle literature as a way of approaching pre-modern maternity has been very scant. Ronald Finucane's 1997 study of the intercession of saints in the lives of children and their families in medieval England represents the most sophisticated attempt to use miracle literature to piece together a history of childhood. In her history of the increasing masculinization of women's medicine in pre-modern Europe, Monica Green affirms the importance of religious sources in piecing together women's physical and emotional experiences of motherhood, which are largely absent from the historical record, particularly for those mothers for whom the birth of a child was not a great matter of state. The inseparability of bodily and spiritual concerns in the Middle Ages and the early modern period make religious sources, I think, a really invaluable part of reconstructing women's healthcare and women's role within the domestic sphere. In contrast to the expensive and the urbanized recourse to professional help, religion is a very democratizing force of aid that could be drawn upon regardless of social stature or wealth. Monica Green says that a history of medieval women's healthcare could be written entirely from saints' lives or canonization proceedings. And what do these texts tell us about mothers? Well, for a start, mothers, expectant mothers and would-be mothers are recurring characters in a cast of supplicants across these collections. Mothers are very well represented in these texts. And while we should be aware that shrine books have their own generic codes, they have their own textual aims, they're mediated by a number of actors, they're nevertheless a particularly rich source of information for gleaning not only what affected mothers, but how they felt about it. The narrative form of these miracles lends themselves particularly well to a holistic understanding of how infertility, childbirth, accidents, illnesses affected mothers' lives. They introduce us to the people involved, to their problem, how this affected them, and how they were understood to respond to this in prayer. The protagonists tend to be drawn from a kind of broad cross-section of society, so we're given the opportunity to explore the emotional dimensions of motherhood across the social stratum. It can be convenient to dismiss miracle collections as a compendium of fabrications that primarily serve a commercial function to support the shrine. But the proliferation of these kinds of texts and the many miracles that they document, I think, tell us something about the ways in which people understood the relationship between their lives and the intercessory power of the divine. I'd now like to move on to, for the remaining part of this session, to think about just a few of the textual and the rhetorical strategies that are commonplace in these texts that could inspire hope in a maternal audience. I'm going to briefly touch on 4 rhetorical features of these texts that could elicit hope in a maternal audience. The number and type of maternal crises, the apparent hopelessness of the context in which the mother and the miracle narratives finds themselves, the distress of the mothers, and the gestures of hope that the mothers display. So the first strategy is the variety of maternal issues that these texts address. The miracles in these collections make the point that there is virtually no maternal crises that cannot be remedied by the help of the Virgin Mary. These texts are particularly concerned with 3 kinds of maternal crisis: infertility, childbirth, and the loss of a child through illness or an accident. All of these situations were particularly frightening and undesirable. As Daphne Mcguire has noted, infertility for women was an emotional matter in early modern society. Childless men tended to be concerned about producing heirs insofar as it mattered to controlling business interests or passing over control of a farm or the continuation just of their name. But for women, infertility presented an existential dilemma that really sort of shattered the expectation of what it meant to be a lay woman, and it was laden with all sorts of ideas about witchcraft or about being punished by God. Infertility is really at the heart of the early modern nexus of ideas about the body, about faith, about family, and it did hurt women in particular. In his 16th century treatise on earthly suffering, the Tratado de la Tribulación, the Jesuit historian and hagiographer Pedro de Rivadeneira dedicates a whole chapter to consoling couples who can't have children. And he writes that este deseo de tener hijos los casados es natural y muy vehemente, especialmente en las mujeres. Childbirth, on the other hand, was one of the single greatest dangers that a woman could expect to experience in her life in early modern Europe. And regardless of the statistical likelihood of dying in childbirth, Ulrike Tanke notes that the death rate was high enough for everyone to know of such cases, and independent of its actual likelihood, death in childbirth was a danger that would have loomed large in women's consciousness. And of course, for the mothers that survived the rigours of childbirth and the perils of postpartum illness, there were many dangers ahead in their journey of motherhood, as accidents, chronic diseases, and acute medical emergencies could claim the lives of their children. The theory that infant mortality rates in pre-modern Europe were so high that parents couldn't afford to love their children, which was a thesis kind of proposed by Philippe Ariès back in the 80s, has since been quite robustly discredited, and documentary evidence means that we know that mothers cared deeply about their children and they were devastated when they died. These maternal miracles form about 15% of the total miracles in these collections. It's not a large number, but it's not insignificant either. Listeners to these miracles might glean from these collections that mothers are not marginal, that Mary can intervene on behalf of mothers in various stages of their motherhood. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that if mothers are so prominent in the miracles themselves, that they were also prominent among the readers and the listeners of these texts. We should also remember that these tales, these miracles, aren't just verbatim accounts that represent the totality of the miracles recorded. These miracle collections are subject to an editorial process. They're there because a chronicler or an editor or a scribe or someone down the line said that they should be. And I don't have the time this morning to think about why, but it does seem to me that perhaps one reason for the prominence of a range of maternal miracles in these texts is that the compilers and the chroniclers and the editors perhaps had mothers in mind. Another generic feature of these texts is that the chroniclers are concerned with creating a kind of verisimilitude. They craft narratives that are, for the most part, concerned with situating the supplicants in a particular space, time, and place. They give them names, they explain their predicament, and in other words, they're not just faceless, nameless supplicants, but they're people who could very well be real. And I'm using quotation marks quite deliberately there because there is no way for us to verify the veracity of these claims or the identity of the people who claim to have been helped. But nevertheless, there is a kind of sense of realism, not to kind of be too anachronistic. There is a sense of realism in these texts, which are, in a sense, deeply unreal. They describe healings that are miraculous, that cannot be explained by medical science or by reason or logic. They inspire hope insofar as they speak to an audience that gets to hear about miraculous healings that happen not to anonymous people, but people who could very well be like them. Another source of hope to a pious listener might also be that the situations of these supplicants are routinely framed as being particularly hopeless, and that by being remedied, this offers comfort to those listening, that, you know, if Mary can help this person out in this terrible situation, well, she might be able to help me out. For example, when it comes to infertility, a very frequent refrain is that these women have been infertile for muchos años. In the narratives that recount a woman's experiences and their supplications to Mary in childbirth, women are presented as being on the brink of life and death. In the Peña de Francia collection, this is particularly acute. In April of 1605, Maria Sanchez from Villas Buenas in Salamanca, she experienced a recio parto, which left her al extremo de la vida. Maria de Brito from La Palma was left fatigada y en gran peligro de la vida con 3 días when she appealed to Mary to save her life. And related to this point about miraculous outcomes in apparently hopeless cases, the chroniclers also pay particular attention to the emotional distress of mothers, and this is a point I find particularly interesting. They're not just recounting the kind of bare bones of the story, they're embellishing them with all sorts of details about how the mothers felt when they were infertile or when their child died. for a maternal audience, I think this is quite a powerful rhetorical hook. It speaks to mothers using a kind of vocabulary and appeal to experience that they would understand, and they stress that Mary can still help and comfort those women who are experiencing profound distress. In the Montserrat collection, we encounter a mother from Girona whose daughter fell into a pond and drowned. She was inconsolable, and despite the best efforts of her neighbours, we read that her dolor no admitía consuelo. Her distress sends her into a sort of mania. She's shouting and screaming, and she falls to her knees and she cries to God, and she vows that she's never going to allow her daughter to be buried. And she instead prays to the Virgen de Montserrat, and she is brought back to life. In the Guadalupe collection, a young boy fell off a cliff, and he died as a result of his injuries. And his mother was so beset with anguish that she was totally pitiable to see. We read that fueron tales las ansias y extremos que era compasión mirarla. And this kind of emphasis on the suffering, not of the child, but of their mother, seems to me a very effective rhetorical strategy for evincing hope from an audience by foregrounding the distress of the mother, who still manages to kind of retain hope in the intercessory power of Mary, and whose anguish can still be remedied. An audience is invited to witness how even in the most distressing situation, Mary can still intervene. And I don't want to neglect the displays of hope that we see in these narratives either. Time after time, we read tales about the esperanza of these mothers and the fe of these mothers, and how they continue to hope and have faith in the intercessory power of Mary, even whenever a resolution seemed beyond the bounds of possibility. And here's when we begin to see a recurring kind of vocabulary of hopelessness, of futility against which Mary intervenes. So in the Montserrat collection, we read a story about another young boy who falls off a cliff and dies, and his mother, Eulalia, is devastated. We're told that nothing else had worked. Todo ayuda y socorro fuese en vano. And yet she still prays to the Virgin Mary, who saves her son. Staying with the Montserrat collection, we read about another boy from Mcguire who in 1548 is mauled by a pig and left disfigured. And the surgeons can't do anything. They try all sorts of help from neighbours and from medical professionals, and the boy, they can't do anything to help the boy. And then he is eventually restored to full health when his mother pleads with the Virgen de Montserrat. When the son of Catalina Galarza is cured from an illness, she prays siempre con esperanzas de verle vivo to the Virgin of Atocha, and he is saved. So we see these examples in a kind of constant refrain in these texts about how mothers retain hope even in these apparently hopeless situations, which I think are an interesting model of faith and piety to a maternal audience. What I think is a kind of takeaway from these miracle collections as a reader is that when mothers hope, their children can be saved, or they can have children when they thought they previously couldn't have children, or they survive a childbirth that they thought was very dangerous. And I think the chroniclers of these texts curate and they present these texts in such a way that it invites a maternal audience to hope as well. As I've shown, they draw upon a raft of generic conventions that could make a maternal audience believe that these kind of miracles could happen to them. Of course, the caveat is that we need to be attentive to the commercial functions of these shrines, not least maintaining a healthy skepticism about the veracity of the claims in them. But nevertheless, I think relatively little work has been done on shrine literature as a generic category of literature, on the reception of shrine literature, the use of shrine literature as a means of piecing together a history of motherhood. And I'm very, very much at the early stages of completing this work, but I'm very, very excited to continue. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ana Rodriguez. I'm an associate professor at the University of Iowa, and my presentation is going to consist of a short introduction to women's writing in Spain during the 16th and 17th centuries, followed by a brief analysis of Ana Caro's Valor, Agravio y Mujer. courage, betrayal, and a woman scorned, focusing on how this play questions gender relations and transforms the traditional role of women in the Spanish Comedia Nueva. The title of this talk is Wise and Valiant, Ana Caro and Golden Age Female Writers, a title inspired in the exhibition Tan sabia como valerosa, Mujeres y Escritura en los Siglos de Oro, which I had the honor to curate and is currently open at the Cervantes Institute in Madrid, paying homage to women who wrote in Spanish in the 16th and 17th centuries. During the 16th and 17th centuries, women in Spain were conditioned by strict limitations which reduced their presence to the domestic space and limited their public lives. The ideal woman would be restricted to her role as wife, mother, daughter, or sister, and would not participate in issues beyond the domestic sphere. For instance, Luis Vives, despite generally defending education according to his humanist beliefs, considered that for young women, kindness, honesty, and tasks which would be typical of their gender would suffice. In this context, women's intellectual education was not only not a priority, but was discouraged. Also, learning how to read would not necessarily imply learning how to write, since the goal of the former was to facilitate access to religious writings, and numerous moralists showed concern about the possibility that writing would provide women with access to knowledge. In fact, prestigious authors mocked the model of the knowledgeable woman, considering it something ridiculous. In this context, female writing was perceived in the worst cases as a threat to the established order, and in the best cases as a minor contribution to the world of writing. Writing was for many women a heroic act. By writing, women revolted against what was expected from them and automatically became suspicious and exposed to the scrutiny of a cultural universe that was not ready to embrace them as new members. The discrimination suffered by women in the access to writing was evident. Similarly, their works were judged in the light of critical prejudices. Despite everything, many women managed to overcome these difficulties and wrote. Some succeeded in something even more difficult, publishing, offering their text to the public, represented their place on the stage, and achieving the recognition of contemporary and future readers. There was a considerable number of female writers in the 16th and 17th centuries in the Hispanic world. Many of their works have never been published or received critical attention, which has condemned them to oblivion. A considerable number of the women that wrote them were nuns who produced their works in convents. Conventual writing covers a huge variety of genres: poetry, history, biography, diaries, drama, letters, novels, and even travel books. Like, for example, the travel book entitled Fundación del Monasterio de Capuchinas de Jesús, María y José de Lima, which is a chronicle of the foundation of the Monastery of the Capuchinas de Jesús, María y José in Lima, and also includes the narration of the fascinating journey to America of a group of nuns who, risking their lives, ventured to the unknown and experienced a variety of adventures. One of the nuns passes away during the trip, victim of breast cancer, which they call Zaratán, a quite common illness in convents. This text offers one of the few reflections by a woman of that time about this illness, its treatment, and its lethal outcome, unavoidable at the time. Besides, it includes descriptions of the resection of the nuns in Buenos Aires and Lima, and the parades and religious festivities in which they took place. All these accounts appear in a context where the female body, traditionally hidden in veils and habits by the same strict norms to which these texts were subjected, acquires prominence in this account when the vicissitudes of the journey uncover wounds, burns, pain, and various disorders. For many women who longed for reading, writing, and creating, the convent became a paradoxically liberating space to fulfill these activities without the constrictions which married life would have imposed upon them. Convents were sometimes literate communities where most of the texts written by women in these 2 centuries were produced. A large number of these writings remain in the archives, unexplored and awaiting to be rescued from an unforgivable oblivion, which has caused those chronicles, autobiographies, poems, and theater plays to be excluded from the analysis of a fascinating age. They are of the undisputable interest for the study of our history and culture, and moreover, the reading of these works provides us with pivotal tools to deepen our understanding, not only of how these authors gradually acquire authorship, but also of the complexities of female subjectivity seen through the voices of women themselves. Santa Teresa de Jesus and Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz are the main representative authors of female religious writing in Spanish during the 17th and 16th centuries. However, many other nuns contributed to the huge richness of this type of literature, such as Ana de Jesus, for example, who also compiled Santa Teresa's works, hugely contributing to the early spread of her name and work. For her part, María Jesús de Ágreda was one of the most important mystics of the 17th century. Beside texts of this mystic theme, she left numerous letters. She kept a continually active correspondence with King Philip IV, to whom she frequently advised in state matters. Marcela de San Félix, the daughter of Lope de Vega and Micaela Luján, entered the convent of the Trinitarias Descalzas in Madrid at the age of 16. There, she developed a plentiful work, of which only one volume remains nowadays. Marcela herself, following the recommendations of her spiritual advisor, burned the other 4 volumes as well as her autobiography. Besides the interest that her works can incite, the self-destruction of the majority of it illustrates the huge difficulties suffered by these authors, having to face a world that questioned their writings and the fact that they were produced by a woman. However, it was not only in convents where female writings arose in those centuries. Other women, mostly aristocrats, since these were the ones who could learn how to read and write, wrote to different degrees and with varying success, revealing their desire to create and the awakening of a creative consciousness. Also, we find these texts as challenge not only to the social norms, but also to literary structures. Thus, while searching for their own creative identity, they managed to innovate and develop their own creative forms of expression in comparison to the prevailing masculine models. María de Zayas and Ana de Caro de Mayén are the most remarkable secular female authors of these centuries. María de Zayas was admired for the quality of her works, both in Spain and abroad, from very early on, and has attracted a lot of attention amongst critics, especially from the last decades of the past century. Zayas' stories introduce us to a universe characterized by suffocating cruelty, extreme violence, and a sense of paralyzing powerlessness when the female characters are confined, sometimes physically and always symbolically, in a patriarchal prison which ends up destroying them. In the face of this undeniable reality, Zayas proposes taking control of language, of women's stories, breaking the silence and transforming pain in a weapon that arises through the act of textual creation. Simultaneously, she reclaims a space both for women who write, like her, and also for female creativity in general, which was otherwise isolated to the margins of cultural life and condemned to irrelevance and disappearance, like the female bodies in her stories. Zayas constantly defends the rights of women to be educated and to access and take part in the cultural world. Unsurprisingly, she also became a strong advocate for the intellectual capacity of women. María de Zayas admired another great author of her time, the playwright Ana Caro. Ana Caro is indeed the most famous Spanish female playwright of the 16th and 17th centuries. Very few of her works have survived until today, and the most popular ones are 2 plays, El Conde Partinuples and Valor, Agravio y Mujer. These comedias transform the characterization of female characters and propose behavioral models which are far removed from the passivity of the ideal of a lady at the time. The highest achievement of her works is precisely opening new spaces for female positioning in issues as complex as love, honor, marriage, or friendship between women, which Caro accomplishes by questioning traditional values and subverting the expectations of the audience. Furthermore, in her works, like María de Zayas and Sor Juana, she reclaims women's capacity to write and take part in the vibrant cultural life of the time, appealing to the long tradition of female writers as a way of authorizing female creativity activity. One of the characters in Ana Caro's Valor, Agravio y Mujer states that even women wanted to versify, and I quote, "they even now dare to write plays." One of these women is Ana Caro, the author herself, one of the Spanish playwrights who have been relegated to the critical margins as minor figures, but who question many critical commonplaces in the history of European theatre, including, for example, the usual recognition of Afra Ben as the first European professional playwright. In 1641, when Ben was barely 1 year old, Ana Caro was already demanding that she be paid for some works in Seville. Courage, Betrayal, and A Woman Scorned, or Valor, Agravio y Mujer, belongs to the genre known as Comedia Nueva, and it unfolds a conflict around love and honor, themes that, as Lope de Vega had stated, were especially fruitful in attracting the public's attention. Ana Caro follows these rules, but she adapts them into a very original vision of love relationships, offering alternative models of behavior for gender relations. Theater was, with no doubt, the most popular genre in 17th century Spain, and several critics have explained how important it was as a tool in the formation of a collective conscience that conformed to the socio-political behavior promoted from civil and religious authorities. But it would be very limiting to try and fit all the plays that were written and performed at the time within this regulatory system of consciences. And works such as Courage, Betrayal, and A Woman Scorned confirm this diversity. We're faced with a surprisingly courageous text, which confronts firmly established models of gender relations and proposes alternative discourses that organize masculinity and femininity. Given the high rates of women's illiteracy in most locations and social groups, the performance of these ideas on the stage had enormous potential to really transform consciences. The work of Zayas and Ana Caro, among others, reveal an explicit will on the part of their authors to turn them into vehicles for expressing their opinions on certain current issues that affected women, answering or reinterpreting them from their own points of view. Ana Caro creates a comedia, where the protagonist is a woman who, after being abandoned by her lover, Don Juan, decides to dress as a man, travel from Seville to Flanders, and take revenge in her own hands, following the model of historical and mythological heroines that inspire her to take action. Leonor becomes Leonardo and changes her appearance, her own history, and her voice to achieve her goals. Her manipulation includes the seduction of Estela, countess at the court of Brussels, who surrenders to Leonor's charms and chooses Leonardo among the many men around her, including Don Juan. Both in her role as Leonardo and when she embodies her true identity as Leonor, the protagonist exercises control of the events of the story all the way through the end of the play, when she changes her strategy and decides that marrying Don Juan will be a better solution than the original revenge that had brought her to Brussels. Leonor is a woman who, through her journey, achieves personal growth and finds her own voice, reaching her goals actively and intelligently. The male characters are puppets that move at the mercy of Leonor's interventions, an ability that seems to be transferred also to Estela as the text progresses, transforming her into a character who does not hesitate to express her opinions and who, in the last scene of the play, asks Don Fernando for marriage. Ana Caro gives her protagonist a happy ending that rewards her talent, her wit, and courage. Even if from our modern sensibility, the marriage between Don Juan and Leonor may look more like a surrender to social norms than a triumph, in the social panorama in which the text is written and performed, marriage is the best possible happy ending that Leonor can obtain. The death of Don Juan, who seems to be the goal of Leonor's revenge at the beginning of the play, would constitute a tragic ending that does not correspond to the genre of the play, and that would also condemn Leonor to a life likewise awash in tragedy and probably locked in a convent. Ana Caro does not want to lock up her protagonist, but instead grants her a lover who practically begs her to marry him, with the status and security that the union of these characteristics grants to the protagonist. In addition, the journey and adventures that Leonor has lived have transformed her. Even if the pre-established social order is restored with marriage, the protagonist is not reabsorbed by the social roles imposed by the dominant system, because her questioning of traditional ideas of masculinity and femininity has caused a definite impact and change. Critics have highlighted Courage, Betrayal, and A Woman Scorned as a subversion of Tirso de Molina's El Burlador de Sevilla. It is no coincidence that the name of Leonor's antagonist is Don Juan, and he is characterized in a very negative way that makes him look very pathetic at various times during the play. Don Juan abandons Leonor after getting tired of her in Seville, quickly becomes infatuated with Estela when he arrives in Flanders, but never manages to seduce the lady, who seems more interested in Leonardo. Indirectly but surely, Ana Caro questions Don Juan's masculinity and characterizes him as indecisive, jealous, manipulative, and a coward, in addition to being also a very bad friend. Ludovico, the Prince of Pinoy, also shares characteristics with Tirso's Don Juan, such as vanity, and for this he's ridiculed by the ladies of the play and even explicitly rejected by Estela. Both Ludovico and Don Juan are overshadowed by the strong personalities of Estela and Leonor. Courage, Betrayal, and A Woman Scorned not only questions gender expectations, but also raises the possibility of a fluid approach to the very concept of gender, when a woman dressed as a man is easily confused with a man not only because of the way she looks, but because of her values and behavior. At the beginning of the play, Leonor states that, and I quote, "My grievance changed my being." Estela, and especially Leonor, are not simply women dressed as men, but manly women, who embody attributes associated with men's ideal behavior as part of their identity, and manage to prevail in a world that sees them as second-class citizens. On the other hand, the stereotypical rivalry between women for the love of the same man is resolved here in a very different way that happens in other comedias. Estela seems at the end of the play closer emotionally to Leonor than to any other character, offering an alternative model to the usual rivalry between women in the commedia and proposing the possibility of establishing a female community. This idea is taken to the verge of its acceptable limits when Leonardo and Estela carry out a mutual seduction game. Even if Leonor is dressed as Leonardo in these scenes, their unavoidable homoerotic components serve to propose their impossibilities for female behavior and to question the expectations of the 17th century audience in a safe setting. The interventions of the funny Rivette, in a very significant aside, only increase the tension of this scene by introducing humorously but directly sexual connotations. And I quote, "Here grace and late glory, amen, now and forever, what a difficult rhyme Leonor sought. She didn't do too badly, given her fancy jabs in verse, since she can do it in prose." This Rivette parliament has been interpreted as a self-reflective word game in which the author defends her ability to compose verses. But I believe that the agudos versos mentioned in the original Spanish version highlight the erotic components of this scene, and they are also reinforced when Rivette again alludes to them only a few lines later, and I quote, "She imagines she'll get a spark from two cold flints. How well can love's fire take hold, even if she's hot? To cool her down, you can satisfy her except with fakery, since you are not well endowed for such a demanding endeavor." In any case, these two readings, one that reinforces the erotic components of these scenes and the one that focuses on Caro's defense of women's writing, are not irreconcilable and reveal Caro's ability to suggest a variety of meanings that collaborate in the questioning of established norms from a variety of angles. Mastery of irony and humor, Caro reproduces through the graciosos, the jester, the fool of her works, vindications, cheeky comments with sexual connotations, and any other issue which would have resulted scandalous coming from a female author. In this way, she manages to introduce in her text extremely subversive elements. At several points in the play, Caro also insists in defending the ability of women in general, and hers in particular, to write. And when the Gracioso explains the reality that there are already women who like her and changing the literary world with their creative contributions, and not as an isolated novelty, but well-founded on a long tradition of successful female writers. Her defense of women's right to claim authorship of their works is reinforced in the last lines of the play, when Leonor, who has just showed the audience what a woman can do, states that the play has a female author, and I quote, "Here, esteemed audience, Courage, Betrayal, and A Woman Scorned ends. Its author as a woman, and a humble one at that, ask that you forgive its shortcomings. It is not only the common topoi of captatio benevolentiae and mea mediocritas what is going on here. Women felt the obligation to justify their condition as writers and their willingness to make their work public. This was a strategy designed to attract the reader and gain empathy for her work, otherwise frequently despised. After centuries of almost complete oblivion, Ana Caro's comedies have been represented again very recently in remarkable spaces, such as the International Festival of Classic Theatre in Almagro, Spain. In this festival, her brilliant plays have captivated the public due to their literary mastery and the relevance of her messages. I have focused mainly on Ana Caro today, but there are other 16th and 17th century Spanish playwrights who deserve our attention. Ángela de Acevedo, Leonor de la Cueva y Silva, author of La firmeza en la ausencia, a dramatical piece which defends women's love perseverance. Feliciana Enriquez de Guzmán, and of course, María de Zayas, author not only of short stories, but also of La traición en la amistad, a fascinating play. Many other women wrote and were successful in these centuries, even if the effect of a powerful patriarchal system has condemned them to obscurity. It is urgent to rescue these writers and to read and analyze their texts, studying carefully how they can transform our vision of what has been traditionally considered as the golden age of Spanish literature. Forgotten for centuries, Manuel Serrano y Sanz started to recover them in 1903 with the publication of Apuntes para una biblioteca de escritoras españolas. However, it was mainly other women, such as Emilia Pardo Bazán in her collection Biblioteca de la Mujer, who started to rescue these female authors and value their contribution to Hispanic literature in earnest. The interest in these works and their authors increased from the last decades of the 20th century due to the rise of gender studies in literary criticism. Every day, new texts and female authors are discovered, and an increasing number of researchers are dealing with their study. We find ourselves here before a field of research in full growth, which provides those who engage with it the huge satisfaction of rescuing from obscurity figures who undoubtedly deserve recognition that has been denied to them for centuries. We need to circulate their texts, discuss their lives and their writings, which will help us to understand the place of women in history, in literature, and in life. Connecting these texts, their topics, with the reality of our day should be a priority because they invite us to rethink the past, the present, and the connection between them, which are quite a few. Thank you very much.